Let's walk around this little camera. I call it little because it is comparatively small when measured against the modern film cameras, or the modern digital cameras, that is. This camera, again, was made in around 1967. Hasn't had a whole lot of use. I bought it used in Japan probably for $75. I could probably get a half a dozen of them today for $50 or less. But it's a rather elegant little thing. I'm very fond of it, and it's still in pretty sound condition. So what the camera does is it constantly allows you to see what's coming through this lens, because the image is going inside the camera and it's bouncing onto a mirror inside, and that mirror is reflecting the image up inside this prism. Through the prism and out back is an image. The image is projected onto a screen, like what's called a ground glass screen. I'm going to hold this up here and see if we can make sense of it a little bit anyway. Okay, so when you look in the camera, you're looking at a glass screen. Down low, you can see your shutter speeds that the camera has available, or maybe you'll see the shutter speed that you've chosen. I'm going to turn the shutter speed wheel right now, and I don't know whether... Okay, as I turn the shutter speed control wheel, they're visible in the viewfinder. Also visible in the viewfinder is a needle on the right-hand side, and also a little circle. The camera has an exposure system, and we'll talk later about how to set the exposure, but those are controls that are important to be aware of. And then there's a focusing ring on the front of the lens, which I'm twisting with my hands to bring an object into focus. And you just have to rely upon your eye to tell whether something is in sharp focus. That's part of the fun. About what the camera does when you take a photo, and then we'll talk about how to control those things. When it's in use, the camera is going to have a roll of film in place. We'll go ahead and put a roll in right now. It drops cleanly or casually into this chamber over here, as long as this device is pulled up. This is called the rewind knob. Once the film's in place, pop the rewind knob down, make sure that it's engaged just a little bit, and then stretch the film across, taking care not to poke or damage the shutter. There's some teeth right over here. This is called the advanced sprocket. You don't need to know the names. Oh, look it. Just by good luck, the tail of the film, this little bit right here, has fallen behind one of those gray tabs. I'm going to remove it and get a little bit longer tail there. I'm going to tuck it in like this. And then there's an advance lever right here. I have to release the shutter as if I'm taking a picture, and then the advance lever will turn. So I've just moved the film into this chamber with one stroke. I'm going to hit this button again. I'm going to advance it again. This is for demonstration purposes. Each photograph is going to make the film move forward. Now the film's kind of springy. Take a look at that. Not a problem. It has to be flat in the back of the camera, but that's what this pressure plate is for. Something else that should be kept clean. This is extremely smooth and it won't scratch the film. We're going to close the back of the camera now. When we close it, it'll latch positively and it will never open again until you lift up on this knob and pull against spring pressure. That should only be done after you've used the knob to rewind the film back into the canister. If you don't wind the film back in the canister, it lies over here in the right-hand chamber, and there are a few worse feelings to a wedding or assignment photographer than opening the camera to take the film out and seeing that. If that happens, just close it as quickly as you can and rewind the film. All that film that was wound up over here, especially if you've taken 24 or 36 pictures, the film that's wound up over here is not all going to be penetrated by light the second you open the back of the camera. Probably the first 5 or 10 pictures will be ruined, but not necessarily all of them. Here we go. Okay, we've put film in the camera, and over here is the film counter. This shows the number of frames or pictures that you've taken. Right now, it says S, which means start. We're not ready to take pictures until we have wound this lever a couple of times. It's not yet on number 1. I'm going to take a picture again. Now, I always worry whether or not I really engage the film accurately in that take-up spool. Here's a habit I developed years ago, just to have some confidence. Before I wind the film the next time, I advance this rewind lever. Now, the rewind lever will not actually take the film all the way out of the camera without pressing a special release button. So I can wind this up until there's some gentle tension. Doesn't want to go any further. Then the next time that I wind the film advance, guess what? Ha! Proof positive. I am actually taking pictures. A film photographer's other greatest fear is to put that 24 exposure roll on the camera and suddenly they've taken 34 pictures and the film has not stopped advancing. This means it never was advancing. Okay, we'll fire off another picture. That's on frame 1. So for safety's sake, I took a picture on frame number 1, and now I'm taking one on frame 2. Let's see, this is kind of sticky here. Okay, so we're just shooting. Now this little thing doesn't have to unwind each time because there's free play inside the coil of film in the canister. But we've already proven where we are. Now the film that went inside had a special film speed rating. ISO is what we call it now. It used to be called ASA. It doesn't really matter, but right here is where the ASA setting is established. We lift up on this ring, which is spring-loaded, and spin it until the ASA of the film shows right here. In this case, it's 400. So what's going to happen? Let's take the film back out of the camera and show what the camera's doing, and also what you'll do at the end of a roll of film. Let's say you've fired away, you've taken all your pictures. By the way, this will scratch your forehead if you don't keep it in. And you've come to the end of the roll. You advance the film and it won't go any further. You think, oh gosh, the camera's broken. No, it's probably on frame 24 or frame 36, depending upon the film you have. If it won't go any further, then you can't take a picture. You're at the end of the roll. It's time to rewind the film. If you start to rewind it now, it won't go anywhere. Look underneath here. Press this button, which will release the film from the take-up spool side. And there you go. Spin. You don't necessarily need to hold that button. And we'll rewind it until it pops out on the other side. Now I'm going to listen for the sound. I don't actually want to take the film 100% out. It's my training rule. Okay, I heard a noise. That means it's released from over here. If you're going to take the film in for processing, wind it a few more times so that you're sure it's completely in the canister. No real reason not to. If you leave the tail sticking out of an exposed roll of film, you run the risk of forgetting whether you exposed that roll or not. Photographer's third fear, double exposing pictures that were already exposed once. Okay, there's that ISO number, 400. On a newer camera, when you put this film inside, the camera will actually have little gold contacts or sensors that read this silver area, and they can be seen inside this chamber. This is an old camera. It doesn't have any way of knowing. Okay, let's finish advancing the shutter. Now this shutter is a piece of cloth with a slot in the middle. It opens and closes to expose the film to light. Let's move the shutter control to a slow speed, a comparatively slow speed, say 1/4 of a second. And let's put an object over here so we can see what the camera sees, because black is just not so easy to see. Okay, so I'm going to advance the shutter. There's a 1/4 second exposure. We're going to move it up to 60. Now, that's a 60th of a second, obviously not 60 seconds, and it's red. I could explain what the red means, but the most simplistic explanation, it's not really true, but it happens to work well, is this is the safest, slowest shutter speed that you can use with a normal lens. This camera is equipped with what's called a 50mm lens. That's a normal degree of magnification. Most people can hand-hold a picture safely at a shutter speed that's about the magnification of the lens. You see that right there. This is a 50mm lens. A 60th of a second is kind of a safe speed. If you're particularly shaky, or you take lots of pictures standing on one foot, or while riding a pogo stick, or from a car, crank it up. but it's a good safe guideline. If you're taking photos at a 30th or a 15th or an 1/8 of a second and you don't need to, keep in mind these photos will probably be blurred unless you're taking steps to minimize the movement of the camera. So let's go to a 60th of a second, and now there's just a very brief moment. When we come all the way up to a 1,000th of a second, that moment doesn't look that much faster. What's happened is a very tiny slot is moving across, and there is no one moment where everything is open. Whereas if we go to a slow speed, the first half of the slot opens, and it's followed by the second. A curtain travels, and a second curtain follows. Now what happened when the shutter was open? We're going to go to a position called B for bulb. That comes from the old days where a photographer would hold a button down, and the shutter opens, and then somebody else would fire a flash bulb, and they'd let the shutter go, and they'd have a picture. In this case, it lets us look inside the camera and just see what's going on. We're looking right through the lens, and the mirror that I showed before is not in position. The mirror has bounced up out of the way, and the view in the viewfinder is blank because there isn't anything to be seen without the mirror in position. A couple of other things are happening though. Well, the shutter's opening and closing, exposing the film to light. The mirror swings out of the way ahead of time for that to happen. And the lens itself has a control on it. We've already talked about the shutter and the shutter speed, but the lens has what's called an aperture setting or an iris or an f-stop. They're all the same. Just like the human eye, lenses have an adjustable iris or aperture or f-stop, which controls how much light gets through to the object. And there are many different variables that control how much light you might want to reach the object, but we're going to go over the fundamentals today. Here is that iris. It's in between a sandwich of glass elements. This lens has probably 6 or 7 different lens elements that all make it up. So all we're doing is demonstrating what these numbers correspond with. The 1.4 number is the maximum aperture setting for the lens that gathers the most light. That number varies. Many lenses have much smaller apertures than that, which is a higher number. Here's 4, 5.68. These numbers cross over all photographic lenses, and the in-between settings don't have numbers here. On a digital camera, the digital camera will set spaces in between, and it will tell you what they are. Not important right now. So the only funny thing is, when you look inside the camera, that aperture that's closed right now, what happened? It's not closed. Let's take a picture though. Oh. Well, the reason that the aperture is open now is so that the photographer can view clearly and brightly what's going on. At the moment the photo is taken, the aperture is going to close and record what it was actually set for. Big difference if you had to look in this camera with the lens actually closed down to the aperture that you're going to shoot at. Each f-stop number cuts the light in half. So for instance, 1.4 gives twice as much light as 2, which gives twice as much light as 2.8, twice as much as 4. So I'm not going to do the math, but this light over here is probably 128th as much light as the light over here. It corresponds with the shutter speeds in that each change in shutter speed either doubles or cuts in half the amount of light reaching the film. Don't worry about the finer points. Obviously 2 times 60 isn't 125, it's 120. We never split hairs about that sort of thing. Okay, let's take some pictures. The first thing we want to do is see whether the battery is working or not. BC, battery check. Now this battery is probably good for, I don't know, 10, 20 hours of use, but not limitless. So at the moment I've got a fresh battery in here, and we'll see how to check it. We'll look through the viewfinder, and over to the right you see a needle. The needle is right at a position where there's a little black bump sticking out. It's very different than when the meter is turned off. So if you're wondering what's going on, yeah, the battery must be working, because look where the needle is now. So I'm sorry. the needle's gone to the top, sort of an off position. Let's turn the meter on and look inside the camera and see if it likes the exposure settings we have. Well, it doesn't. We want the needle and that little circle to match. We can adjust them by rotating the shutter speed. And if you look in the bottom window, you'll see that the shutter speed is currently probably 1/4 of a second. I can't read this close. But I can adjust the shutter speed by spinning it up here on the top of the camera, and voila, I've now adjusted for an accurate exposure. I can also take that shutter speed back to where it was, and I can try to adjust the lens aperture. Sorry this is so shaky, but I hope you took your motion sickness pills today. We're going to rotate the aperture setting instead. The camera is calculating a combination of shutter and aperture setting to put the right amount of light on the film. There we go. Okay, here's all we actually did. Was first of all, the meter's turned on the bottom of the camera, and then this wheel is the shutter speed. If you know that you don't want to change the shutter speed, then find the one you're going to use. Let's say you leave it at 60th and only adjust the aperture. I would say that that's a much more common way of using a film camera, is the photographer decides first on the shutter speed and then adjusts the aperture as conditions change. This means, though, as you're walking around taking photos, or even doing photos in kind of one location but moving yourself just a little bit, photographing items of different brightness, etc., the camera's light meter is going to continue to tell you to make changes. You want to make that adjustment when you're actually looking at the image the same way that you plan to take the photo. There are plenty of finer points about how to adjust and set the exposure and fine-tune it and get it correct. We're not concerned about those right now. Let's go over all the other camera controls, though, at this point. First control, turn off the meter. Now, if you get in the habit of using the meter all the time, you won't ever forget to turn it on because you'll look in the camera and the meter won't be working. This is a shoe for a flash. Some people call it a cold shoe because it's a shoe to mount a flash that doesn't have any buttons. A modern camera has what's called a hot shoe with not buttons but with electronic contacts that send information up to the flash. This old camera here, when you put a flash on it, it had a coiled cable or some sort of cable, something that probably was very annoying, and you'd plug it into the side of the camera. But we're not going to worry about that with this particular camera at all. Let's look at the other controls. On the front is a device called a self-timer. As long as the shutter has been cocked, the self-timer can be drawn out of position, and then it's going to wind back and take a photo. Now, I'm not sure whether or not, in this case, I've advanced the film, but I didn't take the self-timer all the way down. If I pull it all the way down to the end of its travel, it will stop. It won't try and go back, and then I'll release the shutter by pressing that button, and the whole approximately 10-second cycle will commence. Here's a little wheel. It is a wheel, although it looks like it isn't. You rotate it with your fingers to flip the mirror out of the way inside the camera. There isn't any particular reason that we need to do that. Although it's kind of curious, now you can see the other side of that cloth shutter inside the camera body. At any rate, this can always stay in its current position, which is down, ready for action when the next photo is taken. Here's a lever that will give you a chance as a photographer, when you're looking through the viewfinder, to preview or to see that lens aperture, what it's going to look like, what the image is going to look like when you take the photo. So here's what I've done. I've just pressed it in. The lens is preset to f11, which is a relatively small aperture, and what's happened is the iris has closed down to that position. I can press it again and restore it. This is worth messing around with, but in normal photography, not an important thing to use.